Happy 4th of July!
Anti-ICE protests are growing more violent in Minneapolis. Demonstrators repeatedly clashing with federal officers over enforcing the nation's immigration laws. Large crowds confronting ICE agents interfering with lawful operations there, and dozens arrested. The city's mayor insisting this current immigration operation is not actually about cracking down on crime. Here he was earlier.
Are willing to work with people when it's about murder and when it's about crime. But the truth is that this ain't about that. Why is the largest scale immigration enforcement action taking place where we don't even have that many undocumented immigrants? We do work with the federal government. In fact, we're presently doing that. We're presently doing this.
Texas,
so the truth is it's not about murder or crime. It's not.
Homeland Security Assistant Secretary Tricia McLaughlin, lots to unpack there. Is Minneapolis cooperating with ICE?
No, unfortunately not at all, Dana. We've arrested 25 criminal illegal aliens off of the streets of Minneapolis, and we have seen no help from state or local government in Minneapolis. But I think the American people should know, when we talk about our sanctuary city, what are we talking about? First and foremost, their state and local law enforcement are not allowed to engage with our law enforcement when our law enforcement is being assaulted, impeded, or obstructed. They're not allowed to answer calls for backup. That's why we see those growing violent crowds around our law enforcement as they try to enforce operations on the ground. But it also means, and this is so important, that our law enforcement officers are not allowed into the jails in Minneapolis. So we have murderers, we have rapists, we have child pedophiles. I mean, Dana, just look at this. An individual who was charged and convicted for murder of his 3-month-old son from Guatemala. That's one of the guys we've picked up. Known and suspected terrorists. An individual who was convicted of perpetuating human slavery. Those are the individuals who have been in these jails in Minneapolis. 470 of them. And yet Tim Walz has released them back onto the streets of Minneapolis to re-perpetuate the crimes. That's why we have to be out there in full force to make sure we're finding these individuals and we are apprehending them so they don't terrorize more Americans and make for more victims.
All right, so here is another question from Griff's interview. These are some of the individuals you're referring to there, Tricia, in your answer. Here is Mayor Fry when asked about passing judgment too soon. Griff's got the question on that. Let's listen.
Would you agree that no one should be jumping at conclusions until we have that investigation, and then we'll find out what facts can come to light?
When you have the secretary working at the federal government saying immediately that this was an action of self-defense, when you have the federal government booting the state government from the process entirely, yeah, there's concerns associated with that. I mean, look, we've all seen the video. I don't need to pass judgments here.
So based on that reaction, and when you cross-reference with the initial reaction, is he backing away in terms of his language?
It sure seems like he's creating some daylight between his language. I mean, the first thing he said after this incident was telling ICE to get the F out of Minneapolis. When I just listed some of the individuals that Minneapolis, their politicians and sanctuary policies are harboring. So I certainly think that he's backing away from that a little bit. But as far as our response from the federal government, Secretary Noem and President Trump were very measured. This is a serious moment, and we wanted to make sure we gave the American people the accurate facts quickly in a timely manner with ultimate transparency. I know the DOJ is conducting that investigation. We've put out quite a bit of footage of what happened with that incident from multiple different angles so the American people can see for themselves. And I do believe the American people are largely concluding that the individual in question, she weaponized her vehicle. She would not comply with law enforcement operations. She had been stalking them all day long. And unfortunately, this was an act of self-defense. And if you don't comply with law enforcement officers, if you use a deadly weapon against them, there are dangerous, and in this case, deadly consequences.
Yeah, and there's litigation that has gone through the courts that does weigh in for the federal government's role here. Joe Rogan, he's got questions about what's happening, and it's probably echoing what many people are thinking. So let's listen to him and get your reaction.
I see the perspective of the people that say, hey, there was an illegal program moving people in here to get votes, moving people in here to get congressional seats, and we've got to change that. I can also see the point of view of the people that say, yeah, but you don't want militarized people in the streets just roaming around, snatching people up, many of which turn out to actually be U.S. citizens that just don't have their papers on them. Are we really going to be the Gestapo? Where's your papers? Is that what we've come to?
So I know you and I talk a lot about communications and PR, and how would the department respond to that concern that he raised?
Well, this answer is very straightforward. If Tim Walz, if Mayor Fry would let us in their jails, we wouldn't have to be there at all. Currently, there are 680 criminal illegal aliens. Dana, that includes murderers, that includes rapists, child pedophiles, people who, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you would never want these people to be on your streets or your neighbors. That's the people who we are targeting, and we are trying to get out of Minneapolis. Because we don't have state and local law enforcement's help, we do have to have a physical presence on the ground there. And I know in the interview as well, and what Joe Rogan just mentioned is the rampant crime we found, more than $9 billion, and we believe that's just the tip of the iceberg. If the state and local government would help there, if they would coordinate with the FBI, if they would coordinate with Homeland Security investigations, we would, on an expedited basis, be finding that fraud. And I think that all Americans would be better off for it. We want to give accountability. We want to give answers.
Let's get to this, if we could, because Minneapolis falls into this category of sanctuary cities. Here's the president yesterday cutting off money to these jurisdictions here. Watch here.
Starting February 1st, we're not making any payments to sanctuary cities or states having sanctuary cities because they do everything possible to protect criminals at the expense of American citizens, and it breeds fraud and crime and all of the other problems that come. So we're not making any payment to anybody that supports sanctuary cities.
So you can look at the number of states, the number of counties, the number of cities in America. What does this mean on the 1st of February? How do things change?
Well, I'm going to leave it to President Trump on operationally how this will happen. But of course, money talks. And Tim Walz and Mayor Fry, if they want continued federal funding in their state and in their city, which their citizens need and want, then they need to start protecting their citizens and their constituents, which we've seen time and time again they haven't done. Mayor Fry claimed that there were very few criminal illegal aliens in his city. Well, just in the last 5 weeks alone, we have found, arrested, and apprehended 2,500. And that includes, as I've said before, rapists, child pedophiles. I mean, when Secretary Noem was just on the ground in Minneapolis, she was part of the arrest of a murderer from Ecuador, multiple child pedophiles. And so, I mean, it's incredibly important these purported leaders step up and do what they say that they want to do, which is protect their constituents. We have not seen that yet.
Tricia, you have got your hands full, and we appreciate you giving us some of your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.
Recently, Minneapolis has become the center of national attention, and not for the reasons you might think at first glance. Anti-ICE protests are growing increasingly intense, with demonstrators clashing directly with federal officers over immigration enforcement actions. On the surface, this seems like another story about sanctuary cities and immigration policy, but the reality is far more complex. What we're really witnessing is a collision between public safety, local government policies, federal authority, and the political narratives that drive them. Let's start with the facts. Federal authorities have reported that in Minneapolis, over the last few weeks, they have arrested thousands of individuals classified as criminal aliens. These include people convicted of serious crimes, murder, sexual assault, child abuse, human trafficking, and other violent offenses. According to the officials, these individuals were released by the city and state authorities under sanctuary policies, which prevent local law enforcement from fully cooperating with federal immigration authorities. Now, the local government, led by Mayor Fry and Governor Tim Walz, has pushed back against these claims. They argue that the federal operation is not primarily about public safety. In fact, their position is that these actions are politically motivated and create unnecessary tension in the city. Mayor Frey has emphasized that no judgment should be made until all facts are verified and an investigation is complete. So, who is telling the truth? On one side, you have the federal officials, Department of Homeland Security, ICE, and representatives like Assistant Secretary Tricia McLaughlin, arguing that local authorities are actively preventing federal officers from performing their duties. They claim that sanctuary policies have essentially created a safe haven for criminals, making it impossible for ICE to detain and deport dangerous individuals. According to federal reports, these policies include restricting access to jails, refusing to answer calls for backup, and limiting cooperation in ongoing investigations. On the other side, local officials maintain that they are protecting communities and that federal enforcement can sometimes overstep, potentially targeting not just undocumented immigrants, but also U.S. citizens. They argue that aggressive federal raids can create a climate of fear, disrupt families, and undermine trust in local policing. From this perspective, the presence of federal officers in Minneapolis is not just enforcement. It's a political stunt, a display of power that can escalate tensions rather than solve problems. This brings us to the heart of the debate: the tension between law enforcement, public safety, and political narratives. The federal government claims it is focusing strictly on dangerous individuals, people with violent criminal records who pose a threat to the general public. ICE argues that without cooperation from local authorities, they have no choice but to have a physical presence on the streets to enforce the law. Sanctuary cities, in this context, are seen as obstructing the very principles of law and order. The mayor and governor, however, contend that federal action should not override local discretion, and that not every undocumented person is a criminal. They emphasize due process, community trust, and the potential for civil rights violations when law enforcement is carried out without transparency or sensitivity to local dynamics. The protests, from their perspective, are a reflection of community resistance to what they see as overreach by federal authorities. What complicates the situation further is the political narrative surrounding sanctuary cities. President Trump has been clear in his approach. Sanctuary policies, in his view, are not just an administrative choice, they are a public safety issue. The federal government has announced that cities and states with sanctuary policies will have their federal funding cut. According to Trump and his administration, money talks and withholding funds is meant to pressure local governments to cooperate in enforcing immigration laws. The implications are significant. Cutting federal funding impacts local services, infrastructure, and programs that citizens rely on. At the same time, it signals to the public that the federal government prioritizes enforcement of immigration laws over local governance preferences. It's a high-stakes political and operational decision, and one that is likely to have long-term consequences for Minneapolis and other sanctuary jurisdictions. But let's break it down beyond politics. What does this mean for the people on the ground? For federal agents, it means operating in a tense, sometimes hostile environment, with protests escalating and large crowds interfering with enforcement operations. For local residents, it's a confusing situation where political and legal battles unfold in public spaces, and where the line between protecting community safety and protecting immigrant rights is hotly debated. The situation also raises fundamental questions about American law and democracy. How much authority should federal agencies have to operate in local jurisdictions? How much autonomy should cities and states retain in determining law enforcement priorities? When sanctuary policies are in place, do they protect communities, or do they put citizens at risk by sheltering individuals with dangerous histories? These are not simple yes or no questions. They are deeply nuanced issues involving law, ethics, safety, and political ideology. It's also worth noting the role of public perception and media coverage. Videos of arrests, clashes, and protests circulate widely, often without full context. Local and national leaders frame the narrative in ways that reinforce their political positions, which can further inflame tensions. In situations like this, facts can sometimes take a back seat to perception, making it harder for citizens to fully understand what is happening on the ground. In my view, the most important takeaway is this: public safety should be the top priority. That does not mean abandoning due process, civil rights, or community trust, but it does mean that law enforcement cannot be hampered to the point where dangerous individuals are freely moving in society. If sanctuary policies prevent local cooperation with federal authorities, then there must be a serious conversation about balancing civil liberties with public safety. At the same time, federal enforcement must be measured, transparent, and respectful of local dynamics. Heavy-handed operations risk alienating communities, undermining trust, and escalating violence. Cooperation, coordination, and clear communication are essential to avoid turning this into a political spectacle rather than an effective law enforcement action. In conclusion, Minneapolis is a case study in the complex interplay between local policy, federal authority, public safety, and political messaging. Federal authorities argue that sanctuary policies are a threat to citizens, while local officials claim they are protecting communities. Protests reflect public frustration and fear, while arrests and enforcement actions highlight the stakes involved. Cutting federal funding adds another layer of pressure and raises questions about governance, accountability, and priorities. At the end of the day, the focus should be on protecting citizens, enforcing laws, and ensuring that justice is served. Both sides must work to balance authority with rights, enforcement with fairness, and safety with community trust. The American people deserve transparency, accountability, and, most importantly, a legal system that protects everyone, not just those in power. This is a complicated situation, and it is far from over. The coming weeks will reveal whether federal enforcement can achieve its goals without causing more harm, whether local governments will cooperate, and whether the debates about sanctuary cities, public safety, and civil rights can find a constructive resolution. Until then, Minneapolis remains at the center of a national conversation about law, order, and the responsibilities of both local and federal authorities.